Welcome to Scripture Casefiles. I will be your host, Disciple Dill. And to start off this new series, the whole point of it is being dedicated to investigating some of the Bible's most fascinating, difficult, and frequently debated questions throughout Scripture. So, covering things that can range from creation to the unseen realm of salvation, prophecy, spiritual warfare, and even the mysteries of Revelation, which will be way down the road. Each episode will open a new case and examine what Scripture actually says. Now, before we get into the actual case, I do want to put this disclaimer up. And I know that may seem silly to a few people, but I want to preface this because there are guidelines here for a reason. I don't want somebody stumbling upon this video and watching it and thinking that I'm making some outrageous claim or that it's something doctrinal. I want you to essentially understand what you're getting yourself into. And in this sense here, the goal of the series is not to create controversy simply for entertainment. It's not to defend a predetermined conclusion. It's not to force a passage into a theological system. It's not even me, thinking that I understand something better than you and am going to be dogmatic on a very difficult question and make it seem like it has an easy answer, because realistically that's not the point. The goal is to compare scripture with scripture. And in every case file, we will begin with the biblical text itself, because that's where we should always start. We'll examine the immediate context, and at times there will be some words that we don't understand, and we will need to look to the Greek and the Hebrew when necessary and trace the subject through the larger story of the Bible. So, what I'm planning on doing by presenting these, views and these opinions is I want to do that as fair as possible, because the way that we'll present it is we're going to consider the strongest biblical evidence supporting each position. We're also going to address the most serious objections. And then we will separate what Scripture clearly states from what interpreters infer. And that's really what it boils down to. Because some cases may lead to a strong and confident conclusion, and others may leave several possibilities open. Whenever the Bible provides certainty on something, we will speak with certainty. Whenever the evidence is less than clear, we will be honest about the limits of our conclusions. And at the end of every investigation, we will issue a case file verdict. And that verdict will summarize what appears most likely. So, what remains possible and what cannot be proven from the text alone. But these videos are not intended to be something more than intellectual investigations. Every case file will also ask why the subject matters. We will examine how the question connects to God's character, the biblical story of creation, the whole point of redemption, the idea of the person of Christ and the work that Christ does. And then also, in a day to day perspective, the way that Christians understand and live their lives out through faith. So I want you guys, as the audience, to participate. These are investigations after all. So as I go through this and study these and examine these, I want you to do the same. Examine the passages for yourself. Test every argument that I make or every point that I make against what Scripture says. And I realistically want you to share the strongest biblical reason for your conclusion in the comments. Because what the goal of this is for thoughtful discussion. It's not for hostility between believers. It's not to say that my denomination's more right than yours, but instead it is to establish this foundation so that we may grow stronger in our faith and become closer to God. So, with that being said, let us get into our first case. Case number 1, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, creation or judgment? So Genesis begins with one of the clearest declarations in the entire Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. But the next verse presents a world covered in darkness and water. It's without form, it's void, and this is where the debate starts to heat up. Because is Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 simply showing us the earth before God had finished forming it and finished filling it, or instead are we looking at the aftermath of an earlier judgment? Could this earlier judgment potentially be connected to Satan? And today, the hope with this investigation is that we will answer some of these questions. So the question in of itself is not whether that God created the world. Scripture's unmistakable about that. The question is what happened between the first two verses of Genesis and whether the text allows a gap between them. So Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 presents God creating the heaven and the earth. But Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 describes the earth as dark, empty, unformed, and covered in water. So the central question of this case file is simple. Are we seeing an unfinished creation? Are we seeing the ruins of an earlier creation that experienced divine judgment? Well, to investigate this question, we must begin with the biblical text itself. So Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 through 2 reads, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." So verse 1 describes God creating the heaven and the earth. Verse 2 then focuses specifically on the earth and describes four conditions. It is without form, it is void, darkness covers the deep, and waters cover its surface. The Spirit of God is already present and moving upon the waters here. So nothing in this scene is outside God's authority. But the question then shifts to whether the scene is unfinished creation or it is ruined creation. The most common reading is that Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 describes the earth at the beginning of the creation process. So this is what we will refer to as view 1 or unformed creation. On this view, verse 1 functions as an opening summary. God created everything. Verse 2 then moves into the condition of the earth before God arranged it into a habitable world. The words without form and void translate the Hebrew expression often written as Tohu Wabohu. And the basic idea is that the earth is unformed and unfilled. So it has not yet been organized into the realms and creatures described later in the chapter. The structure of the 6 days support this reading because during the days, specifically 1 through 3, God forms the world. On day 1, he distinguishes light from darkness. On day 2, he separates the waters. And on day 3, he brings forth dry land and vegetation. Then we see a shift. During days 4 through 6, God fills the realms. So the heavenly lights govern day and night. Birds and sea creatures fill the sky and sea, and land animals and mankind now inhabit the land. So the chapter therefore moves from an unformed and unfilled condition to an ordered and inhabited creation. So, under this view or interpretation, Genesis 1 2 is not describing evil, rebellion, or judgment, but instead it is describing a stage in God's creative work. This could also explain why Genesis does not say, "and God saw that it was good" immediately after verse 2. Verse 2 is not presented as the completed result of a creative day. So it is the starting condition from which the 6 day sequence proceeds. The first declaration of goodness appears after God commands light to shine. Now we're moving on to the second view, which is the gap theory, or a reconstruction of the world. So the gap theory reads this passage a little bit differently. It treats Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 as the creation of the original heaven and earth. It then places an unspecified period between verses 1 and 2. And according to this view, the earth was not originally created without form and void, but instead it became that way because of a catastrophic judgment. So the 6 days that follow are therefore understood as a restoration, reconstruction, or a reordering of a previously created world. Some gap theory advocates will commonly propose the following sequence: God creates the original heaven and earth, angelic beings rejoiced over that creation, a heavenly ruler rebelled and became Satan, judgment fell upon the rebellious order and the earth. And then in verse 2, it describes the resulting darkness and desolation. God then restores the earth and created Adam to exercise dominion under him. But why do some Christians believe the biblical text allows this interpretation? The first argument concerns one important Hebrew word. So the first argument concerns the translation of the word was. The Hebrew verb is hayah. It commonly means to be, but in some contexts it can describe becoming or coming to pass. So gap theory advocates suggest that Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 may be understood as, and the earth became without form and void. So that translation is a possible meaning of the verb in the Hebrew Bible. Um, but the possibility is not the same as necessity. So while that could be an explanation for it, that does not mean that it has to be. So the grammar of Genesis 1 2 does not force the word became. Most translations therefore retain the word was. And this means that the Hebrew word may allow the gap theory interpretation, but it does not prove it. Possible does not always mean certain. Now, the second argument concerns the phrase Tohu Wabohu. Jeremiah 4:23 uses the same expression while describing the devastation of Judah under judgment. It says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. So the surrounding passage describes cities broken down, fruitful land becoming wilderness, and creation appearing to collapse in reverse. So the gap theory advocates argue that Jeremiah's use of the phrase connects without form and void with destruction. That's meaningful evidence, but it can work in two different directions. Because Jeremiah may be saying that judgment made the land resemble the unformed world of Genesis 1 2. In that case, Jeremiah borrows creation language to essentially describe decreation. It does not necessarily mean that Genesis verse or chapter 1 verse 2 was itself caused by judgment. But the third argument comes from Isaiah 45 verse 18. For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it, he hath established it, he created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. The word translated vain is tohu. Gap theory advocates reason that if God did not create the earth tohu, Yet Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 says the earth was Tohu. Something must have happened to it. So there is a change that takes place here. The opposing answer is that Isaiah is describing God's purpose, not necessarily the earth's condition at the first stage of creation. So God did not create the world to remain empty, but he formed it to be inhabited. And Genesis 1 shows him accomplishing that purpose again, and the text creates an interesting connection, but it does not settle the case by itself. The most dramatic part of the gap theory is its connection to the angelic rebellion. Scripture clearly teaches us that Satan and other angels rebelled against God. We can look at passages such as Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, Luke 10, 2 Peter 2, the book of Jude, Revelation 12. All of these contribute to this biblical picture. The issue we run into now is that it's a timing problem. We don't know the exact timing, and it's difficult to establish. But when we put it in the context of how we read this, by Genesis 3, the serpent is already in rebellion. So therefore, Satan's fall must precede the temptation of Adam and Eve. In Job 38, it also describes the morning stars singing and the sons of God shouting for joy when God laid the earth's foundations. So this shows that heavenly beings witnessed at least part of God's creative work. The gap theory connects these passages and proposes that angelic rebellion occurred between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. And this framework can connect several biblical themes. However, Scripture never gives that complete sequence in one passage. It is a reconstruction that is assembled from multiple texts, hence why the gap theory is considered a reconstruction. That does not automatically make it wrong, though. Theology often compares Scripture with Scripture. So honesty requires a distinction between what the Bible states directly and what an interpreter infers. So when we look at what the Bible does say that Satan rebelled. It does say that the earth in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 was without form and void. The Bible, however, does not explicitly state that Satan's rebellion caused what happened in verse 2. So while that connection does remain possible, it is not proven. Now, there are some objections to this idea of the gap theory. One of the strongest objections appears in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. So critics will argue that this places the creation of the entire world within the 6 days and leaves no room for an earlier world. Gap theory interpreters respond by distinguishing between the original act of creation and the later making, ordering, or fashioning of the present world. So whether that distinction works, it really depends on how the words are understood in the context. Exodus certainly presents the 6-day pattern as the basis for Israel's Sabbath. So at a minimum, it warns against treating the 6 days as an insignificant afterthought. However, Romans 5:12 presents another major objection. It says, "Wherefore, as by one man's sin entered into the world, and death by sin." So if death entered through Adam, how could a world have been destroyed before Adam? Well, their response is the first thing to observe is again the subject of Romans 5. So Paul is explaining human sin, condemnation, and justification. Adam brings sin and death to humanity. Christ brings righteousness and life to those who are in him. But the gap theory advocates therefore distinguish between human death through Adam from the judgment of angelic beings or the destruction of a pre-Adamic environment. So critics answer that this distinction risks creating kinds of death not clearly described in the passage. So, some common arguments that I have heard to be made would be things like, does Adam bringing sin into the world create the death of animals, or create the death of nature, like, because trees and things like that may also die in a sense. So is Adam's sin essentially what brings all terms of like anything that can perish into existence, or is it exclusively for humanity? And I think that's the major distinction between these two views, because Romans 5 is extremely important, but it does not directly explain the second verse of Genesis chapter 1. It establishes Adam's role as the head of fallen humanity. It does not give a detailed history, though, of every possible form of death or judgment in the spiritual realm. And an example of that, we could also we could also compare how humanity is judged rather to how the angels are judged by God. Obviously, they do not face the same judgments because of the way Scripture teaches. And in that same regard, Romans 5 creates a serious question for the gap theory, but it does not close the case without further argument. So, what is it that we should conclude then from what we've talked about? The most direct reading of Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 is that the earth was unformed and unfilled at an early stage of the creation week. The grammar naturally describes a condition, and the rest of Genesis 1 shows us that God forms and fills what he had not yet ordered or inhabited yet. So the gap theory is possible. Um, it does look at things from a broader theological reconstructive view. Its strongest observations are the relationship between Tohu and the judgment passages, Isaiah's statement that God formed the earth to be inhabited, and the biblical reality of angelic rebellion before Genesis 3. But Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 does not explicitly mention Satan, rebellion, destruction, or restoration. Those elements must be supplied from other passages. So the verdict of this case file is therefore that the gap theory is plausible but not proven. It should not be treated as a test of biblical faithfulness, and Christians may examine it seriously, but they should not claim certainty where Scripture has left the sequence unclear. The central message of Genesis does not depend on solving every question about verse 2. We know that God is the creator. We know that the darkness is under his authority. We know that the deep is not a rival God. We know that the Spirit is present. And when God speaks, we see light, order, fullness, and life appear. So Genesis does not begin with mankind climbing toward God, but it begins with God speaking a world into order and preparing a place where mankind can live in fellowship with him. Later, sin brings disorder, exile, and death into the human world. So the rest of Scripture moves toward a new creation where darkness is finally defeated and God dwells with his people. So whether verse 2 describes an unfinished creation or the aftermath of an earlier judgment, the theological center remains the same, that God brings order from desolation, light from darkness, life where there was emptiness. And the final answer to the world's brokenness is not a theory about the distant past, but it is Jesus Christ, the one through whom all things were made, and through whom all things will be reconciled. So, what do you believe that Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 describes? Do you think that it's unformed creation? Do you think that it is the aftermath of judgment? I would urge you to give your strongest biblical reason for the conclusion in the comments. In the next scripture case file that we'll cover, we will talk about the fall of Satan. Until then, compare scripture with scripture, distinguish what is written from what is inferred, and keep the text at the center of the case. Remember, study to shew thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. If you enjoyed this video, please do me a huge favor by liking and subscribing to my channel, especially if you are interested in seeing more of this type of content. Until next time, thank you so much for tuning in, and may God abundantly bless you.